He built his cocaine empire on a foundation riddled with violence, blood, and addiction. His menacing brutality forever changed a country, but his dangerous commodity destroyed families and entire communities. This is a story of Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine. For over a decade, the name Pablo Escobar was synonymous with cocaine and violence. He revolutionized the industry of drug trafficking and became king of Colombian coke. Escobar maintained control of his drug empire through intimidation and fear. At the same time, he fed the poor of his land and built them homes, schools, and hospitals. Colombian-born Pablo Escobar is credited with exploiting America's insatiable love and desire for cocaine. Through his marketing strategy of killing anyone who stood in his way, Escobar transformed Colombia's mom-and-pop style cocaine industry into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. Along with his compadres of the Medellin Cartel, he developed a narcotics distribution network that created a drug empire the likes of which the world had never seen. He successfully shipped tens of thousands of tons of the precious powder into the United States and eventually Europe, donning him the godfather of cocaine.
Escobar was a brilliant tactician with a strategy to protect his operations in Colombia and to develop smuggling operations in the United States, which allowed him to enter more cocaine here than any other trafficker at the time.
William Gately spent 21 years as a United States Customs Special Agent. During that time period, he was responsible for numerous drug smuggling and money laundering investigations, including two that specifically affected Pablo Escobar's cocaine empire.
Pablo Escobar was a mafia boss. He was a ruthless drug trafficker who probably killed more people than any individual drug trafficker in the history of Colombia. He was a ruthless killer. This man aligned himself with narco-terrorism. He placed bombs on airplanes. He murdered people. Pablo Escobar was no folk hero. He has blood on his hands in Colombia that'll be in their history books for the next century.
Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born on December 1st, 1949, in the cattle farming district southeast of Medellin during Colombia's era of violence. He was the third child of farmer Abel de Jesus and Hermilda, a primary school teacher. 2 years after his birth, the family moved to Medellin before moving to a series of villages where Hermilda taught school.
He was a Paisa by birth, that is an Antioqueñan, and identified very closely with that region, as many of the people from that part of Colombia do. It's got a very distinct subculture. It's one of the reasons that Pablo Escobar never wanted to leave Colombia to flee to other countries.
Escobar was raised with strong traditional Catholic values. After years of moving about Colombia, the family eventually settled in Envigado outside of Medellin. Bruce Bagley is a professor of international studies at the University of Miami in Coral Gables, Florida. He has lived in Colombia off and on since 1968 and is an expert on Pablo Escobar and narco-terrorism.
He built churches in Colombia with some of the money that he had. He donated, right, to the church in Medellin and in the environs of Medellin. At the same time, he saw no contradiction in killing people, in acting as an extremely ruthless leader of a criminal organization that grew exponentially from the mid-1970s into the 1980s and beyond.
As a young boy, Escobar developed a love for soccer, which he maintained and supported throughout his life.
Pablo Escobar, who was also a sports fan, decided to invest heavily in building up Colombian soccer. And he invested the soccer teams, particularly in Medellin, and he bought the very best talent that he could find everywhere in Latin America. And by the mid and late 1980s, Pablo Escobar and the other members of the Medellin Cartel had built Colombian soccer into a world contender.
He became increasingly discontent and impatient with school. Escobar was very ambitious and quickly learned that money was the ticket to higher social circles in Colombia. It was at this time that he began his career as a petty thief, stealing tombstones and sanding them down for resale.
He was a very bright child from the beginning. Indeed, many of Colombia's major law enforcement officials and ministers have noted that in their conversations with him, his intelligence was stellar. Pablo Escobar never attended college in any serious way, but he was a high school graduate, at least he claimed to be, and he was a very good student.
During the mid-1960s, Escobar's hometown of Envigado began to turn violent. Gangs emerged along with a thriving marijuana trade. While still a teenager, he began to associate with extortionists and car thieves who gathered in Medellin's seedy Jesus de Nazareno district. By the end of the decade, Escobar was an accomplished car thief and automobile smuggler with his own gang.
Everybody who knew him during his youth commented on his quick intelligence and his capacity to absorb information and to put things together in ways that many other people did not. That's one of his greatest talents. It made him an innovative entrepreneur in the clandestine trade of drug trafficking.
Driven by his desire to become rich, Escobar's criminal activities escalated to murder for hire. Escobar's rise through Colombia's criminal ranks was swift and violent. He was young and ambitious, but moreover, he was smart. He knew what he wanted and would not allow anyone to stand in his way. In less than a decade, Escobar had evolved from a petty thief to a cold-blooded contract killer. He served a brief stint in jail for presenting false documents. It was his first opportunity to observe hardened prisoners and the lawyers who defended them. They would later become the core of his organization. Fueled by his love of money and fast cars, Escobar and his cousin Gustavo Gaviria reportedly smuggled their first load of cocaine in a car race.
They recognized when Pablo Escobar was in his early 20s that in comparison with stealing cars or bicycles or windshield wipers or things like that, that you could make a lot more money trafficking in drugs.
Escobar overcame humble beginnings to become the world's wealthiest and most notorious cocaine trafficker. During the 1970s, coke became the drug of choice for the chic, the rich, and the famous. It was also found to be highly addictive. As its use exploded in the U.S., Pablo Escobar and the Medellin Cartel positioned themselves to feed the insatiable demand. The genesis of Pablo Escobar's rise to international infamy began with an airplane flight from Colombia to the United States. In the mid-1970s, the street value of a kilo of cocaine was $35,000, and a small plane could carry millions of dollars worth.
The innovation was utilizing airplanes, dropping off the loads, offloading them to cigarette boats, and then bringing them into the United States by boat, into South Florida particularly. That transportation revolution was one of the major innovations of the Medellin Cartel.
After Escobar's first flight, he decommissioned the small plane and mounted it above the entry gate of his farm so that everyone could see he was smuggling cocaine. By the late 1970s, with just a few flights under his belt, Escobar had already become a millionaire. In 1979, cocaine smuggling would enter an extremely profitable and ultra-violent new era. Pablo Escobar began a partnership with Carlos Leder. Leder was allegedly the biggest of the drug kings. The son of a German engineer, he grew up in Colombia. It was Leder who persuaded Escobar to begin smuggling larger shipments of cocaine in larger planes. The planes were now equipped with long-range fuel tanks, radar detectors, and communications scramblers. To avoid American airspace, Escobar later and others used the Bahamas as a stopover for breaking down the cocaine shipments before smuggling them into the U.S.
They pretty much brought cocaine into the country at will. In South Florida, for example, private aircraft and commercial aircraft were bringing tons of cocaine into the peninsula on a daily basis. In addition to that, hideaways in the Bahama Islands were being used by the Colombian, predominantly the Medellin Cartel.
It was during one of their trips to the Bahamas when they met Robert Vesco. Vesco, who began his career as a machine tool manufacturer, was one of the first international criminals to realize that changes had to be made in the movement of money and the shipping of cocaine. The old practice of smuggling large quantities one flight at a time was now considered to be too risky.
The big loads were coming across the Atlantic from the Bahamas. They were coming in private aircraft, and they were typically 500 to 1,000 kilos at a time, and this is an everyday event. Entire islands were purchased by traffickers and set up with air bases where they transported cocaine from the mainland of Colombia, went to the island.
Norman's Key Island, located in the Bahamas, was purchased by Escobar and later and was converted into a sinister military-type base equipped with sophisticated communications equipment and navigational aids. By the early 80s, Pablo Escobar was to cocaine trafficking what Bill Gates would soon be to the computer industry. He was making over $500,000 a day, but he had serious competition from the Ochoa brothers and the virulent mafioso gangster, Jose Rodriguez Gacha.
Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha was a genius in discovering routes for smuggling into the United States. The Ochoas were very good at laundering money. Pablo Escobar ran the organization, if you like, and he concentrated in his hands the routes that were developed to bring cocaine through airplane traffic into the United States. At first, across the Caribbean and into South Florida. And they innovated in a variety of different ways in that route.
It was together that Escobar later and the Ochoa brothers and Gacha would spread the wealth and share the risk in the lucrative cocaine industry.
What made him different than any other group was this is the first time they were really organized in a cartel-type fashion.
Special Agent Ramiro Escudero spent 12 years investigating drug trafficking and money laundering for the FBI's Los Angeles Field Division.
We consumed the largest number of drugs anywhere in the world. Pablo Escobar was able to take advantage of that and exploit that market. I think before the Medellin Cartel, we had a lot of what we call smaller groups. Pablo Escobar, along with the other members of the Medellin Cartel, were able to mass market the cocaine. They controlled everything from production to transportation and distribution.
He became the king of cocaine, even though in his own country, he had a boss, a fellow named Jose Rodriguez Gacha. But like all bosses, if you've got a captain of your industry that produces more wealth for you than anyone else, then he's your man.
A second major innovation of the Medellin Cartel was what I call their Lloyds of London approach to diversifying the risk. If we assume that there were 5 major participants in the Medellin Cartel in the late 70s and the early 80s, what they did was, rather than send a single shipment in their own name into the United States, running the risk of having it confiscated, each of the 5 major capos would share 1/5 of that load. So over 5 loads, they would get their entire shipments in. But if any one of those loads was captured, each of them only lost 1/5.
The Medellin Cartel was growing stronger and more powerful with every successful shipment into South Florida. By the beginning of the 1980s, Miami was engulfed in a full-scale drug war between the newly formed cartel and the Cuban Mafia, who had controlled Miami's cocaine trade since the 1950s.
In 1979 and 1980, the so-called cocaine wars that took place here in South Florida that ended up with shootouts on various freeways, some 115 people killed.
Even with all the indicators that cocaine was becoming a boom business in the United States, the government, in a law enforcement capacity, didn't react to it until South Florida became a Wild West show.
Won't you join Nancy, Vice President Bush, and me in urging all America's young people to just say no?
President Ronald Reagan responded by appointing Vice President George Bush to head a special anti-drug task force in South Florida.
Within a few months, a 500-member task force was in place and functioning in South Florida. I was transferred there in early '82 as a supervisor in that task force, and in that capacity got to know the cocaine business intimately within a few weeks of my transfer.
With South Florida's drug trade under the control of the Medellin Cartel, Pablo Escobar was now ready to parlay his wealth and power into a position in Colombian politics.
His perception, at least early on, by the average Colombian was, interesting enough, a very positive one.
James Finkenauer is a professor of criminal justice at Rutgers University in New Jersey.
He was sort of like a Robin Hood character in that what he would do is he would use some of his enormous wealth to build housing for the poor and provide other kinds of services for the poor.
Well, Pablo Escobar sought to curry support with the poor segments of Medellin. He recruited many of them, gave them jobs, some as sicarios or gunmen, others as employees in various aspects of his business. He also sought to curry the loyalty of members of his own organization and those people who work for him on the various farms that he bought in the Magdalena Medio.
Pablo Escobar had the wealth and power to buy anything he wanted, and what he wanted now was a political career.
By the early 1980s, Escobar had developed political ambitions. And as he became wealthier, he began to see a political future for himself. And in 1982, he ran for the Colombian Congress, and he was elected as an alternate deputy to the Colombian lower house.
Rensselaer Lee is one of the nation's foremost scholars on international drug trafficking. He is the author of several books, including The Andean Cocaine Industry, which paints a comprehensive picture of the multi-billion-dollar South American narcotics business.
He was embarked on a political career which seemed to be very promising. The trouble was that the money that he got to finance his political career came largely from his activities in the cocaine business. But people in Colombia at that time didn't know. They thought he was a local entrepreneur.
Escobar's time in the political spotlight would be brief. Political enemies and the media sought to reveal the source of his fortune.
He did, I think, genuinely care about those people who were outside the mainstream of Colombian society. And I think he would have been able, I think, to parlay this support among the Colombian poor into a very substantial political career. The only trouble was that he was kind of an interloper in the political scene, and his political enemies within the Liberal Party and in the media and elsewhere, they began to check up on this guy. Who is Pablo Escobar? Where does he come from? And above all, where does he get his money? And gradually, they began to go through the legal records. They found that he had been arrested for cocaine trafficking back in 1976.
The details regarding his arrest were missing from the court's files. The two policemen responsible for the original arrest had been mysteriously murdered, and the judge who had tried the case could not be found. It was clear then that Pablo Escobar had made his fortune through illegitimate means.
According to people who did know him, and one individual who knew him well, he was a demanding and ruthless character. The Robin Hood image only extended to the PR that he wanted known to the rest of the world.
In 1983, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was appointed as Attorney General and launched a campaign to crack down on Colombia's drug trade. The following year, the police raided Tranquilandia, the largest cocaine laboratory ever built.
As the efforts by the Belisario Betancourt administration towards extradition became more intense, as the Attorney General of the country at that time, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, began to bust the operations of the Medellin Cartel, most importantly, Tranquilandia, the biggest refining complex ever constructed in Colombia, capable of producing some 1,000 kilos of cocaine per month. That bust set the Medellin Cartel back in 1984, produced a great deal of ire in Pablo Escobar, and the Attorney General was targeted for assassination.
Escobar ordered the assassination of Bonilla in retaliation for his crackdown against the Medellin Cartel. The list of people murdered at the command of Pablo Escobar was becoming long and vast. He would not tolerate anyone standing in his way, including law enforcement officials or the Colombian government itself. By the mid-'80s, Pablo Escobar and the drug lords of Medellin had amassed fortunes rivaling those of big-time legitimate businessmen. With his worth estimated at between $2 and $4 billion, Escobar was written up in Forbes magazine as one of the world's richest men.
He was able to be an enormously successful businessman. And I mean, let's face it, the cocaine industry drives a lot of employment and provides a lot of opportunities for people in Colombia who wouldn't otherwise have opportunities. And he was a big guy at doing this.
He was the prince of the capos, but they were all in the same ballpark. Each of the Medellin Cartel barones emerged as a billionaire or a multi-billionaire over the latter part of the 1980s.
This is a very, very sophisticated business, the product of which just happened to be cocaine as opposed to TV cameras or VCRs or something. But the business itself structured very much in the same way. And Escobar was the head of one of these two businesses, like the chief executive officer for international business.
Like so many mafia members, Escobar possessed a certain duality. He was a ruthless, murdering drug lord, wanted by the Colombian and United States governments. But at the same time, he was a husband, loving father and philanthropist who provided jobs, built homes, hospitals, schools, and recreational facilities for the people of his region.
Family for many of the members of the Medellin and other cartels in Colombia was very important. On the other hand, he also led a rather licentious life. When he was not with his wife or with his family, they had riotous parties at his farms and in other places where his wife was not there. This became widespread knowledge in Colombia, and many people who sought to partake of the huge profits of the drug trade and the immense wealth of Pablo Escobar and others went to these parties.
Obviously, he bought ranches and farms. He had, lots of accoutrements. He had women. He had horses. He had beautiful fixtures in his homes. He had an antique car collection. He had all the rest of it. He had a zoo, for example. You could go in there. You wouldn't have to pay admission. Just go in there and see the animals. This was another one of these free services that he was giving to the public to enhance his image as being a socially responsible person and somebody who cared about the Colombian people.
In reality, he was a savage entrepreneur, a cold-blooded killer who earned his fortune in the baneful world of narcotics.
His drug trafficking empire became so large and so famous that he was a household word by the time 82 came around. Everyone knew who Pablo Escobar was. It was like who's Joe Gambino or Paul Castellano. They knew who Pablo Escobar was.
His menacing product had destroyed the lives of millions. At the pinnacle of his power, the Medellin Cartel was making between $6 and $8 billion a year.
As a result of their efforts to bring more and more cocaine into the United States, they made up in volume what they lost in per unit price. Americans
were consuming more cocaine than ever, and Escobar was wanted by both the Colombian and the United States government.
Pablo Escobar did fear extradition, as all the Medellin capos did. They knew full well that extradition to the United States meant a lifelong sentence in jail. Carlos Lehr was extradited. He was given life plus 135 years in Marion, Illinois. Pablo Escobar was intelligent enough to know that if he was ever judged in the United States, that the sentence he would get would be 2 lifetime sentences plus 135 years. they formed a group called the extraditables, the extraditables. And those extraditables launched, if you like, a terrorist campaign against the Colombian government to prevent them from extraditing the major figures of the Medellin Cartel.
The narco-terrorism conducted by the Medellin Cartel bloodied South America's fourth largest country for the next 7 years. The cartel targeted anyone who supported extradition to the U.S.
It led to the assassination of a variety of major Colombian officials, judges, police officers, notables in Colombian society. Guillermo Cano, the director of El Espectador newspaper, was assassinated. El Espectador headquarters were bombed during this campaign, and the violence became increasingly indiscriminate.
He used the revolutionary forces of his fighting against the government of his country to protect his operations, providing them with arms and money, housing for their families, and education for their children, churches for them to worship in.
It was open season on government officials, and one of Escobar's methods of persuading judges, politicians, and journalists was through intimidation. It was common practice for Escobar to send a message through one of his many attorneys. He would offer the targeted official a choice between plomo or plata, lead or silver. The messenger would also arrive with a photo album filled with pictures of the victim's home, family, and friends. In return for his life and cooperation, Escobar would pay the official a large sum of money.
Again, because of his power and because of his, I would say, just brute force, he was able to influence a lot of people. The people heard, especially judges and prosecutors in Colombia, would hear the name Pablo Escobar. They would feel like there was a death threat, and they would not get in his way.
In 1985, Colombia's murder rate mirrored that of a country at war. The city of Medellin alone reported nearly 1,700 homicides, the highest per capita in the country. No man, woman, or child was spared in Escobar's campaign of violence against anyone who dared to oppose him. 1 year later, the killings in Medellin more than doubled to 3,500, nearly 10 murders a day.
So Pablo Escobar became increasingly filled with his own power, his own firepower, his own political power, and his own economic power. And he used his billions to, if you like, break down the doors of the Colombian government and to prevent it from functioning as a law enforcement entity against the Medellin Cartel.
They developed ties with Nicaragua, with a number of the Caribbean islands, with Panama, of course, with General Noriega in Panama, with some upper-level functionaries in the Castro government in Cuba, and they were very active in many parts of the hemisphere.
His cocaine empire was steadily growing, and his product was being pushed throughout the world. Meanwhile, the casualties of the drug war in Colombia continued to rise. Escobar and his Medellin cartel were responsible for countless assassinations, including the Attorney General, a justice minister, dozens of journalists, more than 200 judges, and over 1,000 police officers. And the drug war escalated with the assassination of liberal presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán in August 1989.
The terrorist activity sponsored by the Medellin Cartel, and particularly Pablo Escobar, eliminated 3 of the 6 presidential candidates running in the 1990 elections. 3 were assassinated out of the 6. President Gaviria, Cesar Gaviria, was elected because the man who had been picked by the Liberal Party to be their candidate, Luis Carlos Galán, was assassinated at Pablo Escobar's orders in August of 1989. Pablo Escobar's relationship with the Colombian government changed the face of Colombian politics. It changed who was president of Colombia.
After the execution of Galán, the Colombian government intensified its campaign to bring down the Medellin Cartel. Hundreds of airplanes and vehicles were impounded. Thousands of weapons and 25,000 rounds of ammunition were seized. Personal property and commercial real estate was confiscated. The cartel responded by burning or bombing the homes of numerous politicians. But the ultimate example of Escobar's diabolical disregard for life was demonstrated in November of that same year. over 100 passengers prepared to board the Avianca 727 jet from Bogota to Cali. They had no idea that 5 of their co-passengers were informants against the Medellin Cartel. Reportedly, they were responsible for the raid of Escobar's jungle hideaway, resulting in the kingpin's narrow escape through a cornfield. The 6 crew members prepared for takeoff, while the unsuspecting passengers settled in for the flight. The plane ascended into the air. But en route to Cali, the plane exploded in midair, killing everyone aboard. Pablo Escobar had struck again. The charred remains of the Avianca plane were broadcast throughout the world. There seemed to be no escaping the menacing terror inflicted by the powerful cartel. The public's cry to reach a compromise between the government and the drug lords was louder than ever. The continuing war between the Colombian government and the Medellin Cartel was beginning to take its toll on the cocaine empire. For over a decade, Pablo Escobar had exerted his might in Colombia through bribery and murder. During the beginning of the 1990s, Escobar found himself enthralled in an intensifying campaign conducted by Colombia and the United States to bring him down.
Ultimately, Escobar became enemy number one. The Medellin Cartel became a target. Colombia began to believe that their national security depended on the destruction of the Medellin Cartel, and they went about doing this with a certain amount of help from the United States.
So we were, as a government, aware of his power, and we were trying to assist Colombia in either apprehending him or extraditing him to the United States.
He saw an opportunity to strike a bargain with the Colombian government to, in effect, enter into a plea bargaining situation, which would reduce his sentence, eliminate the possibilities of his extradition, and give him a few years in jail, and he would emerge with his money more or less intact, his billions intact.
With a guarantee that he would not be extradited to the United States, Escobar turned himself in under the terms he had dictated to the Colombian government. He financed, designed, and built his own jail named La Catedral outside of Medellin.
It's very hard for the head of a criminal organization to continue to influence that organization in the same manner when they're in prison. You can do it for a little while, but the troops begin to get restless, and you're not there anymore to enforce these rulings. And I think that happened with Escobar.
He felt that he could have the best of all possible worlds. He had many people at that time who were after him, not just the Colombian government. He had his enemies in the Cali Cartel. He had a falling out with some people within the Medellin coalition. And I think he wanted to come into some secure facility where he could rest and relax, and at the same time continue to run his cocaine empire.
He had his own cooks. He had visitors come in. The fence around it kept the military out and kept his rivals out. It didn't necessarily keep him in.
The prison facility that he built was to his specifications. From there, he was able to manage his cocaine empire. He had computers, he had fax machines, he had telephones, he had everything that he needed to communicate with the outside world. And also, he used the prison not just to manage his cocaine trafficking operations, but also to conduct trials, summary judgments against his enemies within the Medellin Cartel. Some people who went there to see him, talk to him, were never seen alive again. So all kinds of things went on in that prison. Escobar was also able to leave the prison at will. He would leave, for example, on a Saturday night to go down to Envigado and go to a local bar and have drinks with his friends, have a good time. He was seen at soccer matches, football matches. He really had quite a good life there until finally it became so obvious what he was doing that the government decided they were going to move him to a military prison, which would have been considerably less comfortable.
Rather than serve out his time in a military prison, Escobar fled La Catedral and lived out the remainder of his life as a fugitive on the run from his numerous enemies.
Escobar had built for himself a protection network. I mean, not just his support structure in Medellin among the poor, he also paid officials, paid policemen, paid army officers, paid other people in authority to tell him when a police raid or dragnet was going to take place and where, so he could get out of the way.
Escobar made many miraculous escapes, but his reign as a king of cocaine had come to an end. The Rodriguez Orejuela brothers of Cali had gained ground in the drug trafficking industry. They were now in position to become the dominant figures in the lucrative yet dangerous cocaine business.
The Rodriguez Orejuelas emerged as the principal figures in Cali, rapidly surfaced over the latter part of the 1980s and the early part of the 1990s as the principal traffickers in Colombia, supplanting Medellin and Pablo Escobar, precisely because Pablo Escobar got increasingly caught up in his own survival and in his terrorist war against the Colombian government.
Escobar was on the run, and his Medellin drug cartel was a mere shell of his former narco glory days. The ravishing effects of the cocaine war had taken its toll on 2 continents and exposed Escobar as a diabolical, ruthless killer who would do anything to push his lethal product. Escobar's escape from his luxurious prison was the ultimate slap in the face to the political establishment. With the backing of the American president, a special Colombian task force was created for the sole purpose of apprehending Escobar.
We intend to see them dismantled and destroyed.
Pablo Escobar had escape routes that allowed him to survive in clandestinity for a lengthy period of time, for a couple of years actually. But this was a kind of desperate existence. The reality was that he had created an organization with loyal followers, both in the Magdalena Media, where he had a number of farms, and throughout Medellin, where he had a number of different residences.
First of all, he has a lot of friends in Medellin. In other words, he has this huge political backing from a lot of the poor people in that city. And so there's a certain loyalty, and he can depend on this loyalty to provide a certain amount of cover or protection. So in other words, there are people who would not turn him in because they think he's almost like a deity of some sort.
But his enemies were closing in.
In 1992 and 1993, the Colombian authorities were making a tremendous effort just to demolish that organization. I mean, they arrested people, they killed something like 200 top-ranking and middle-ranking leaders. They offered surrender opportunities, plea bargain chances for people to come in. Basically, they put the Medellin Cartel out of business.
It became more costly. People simply didn't stay bought, and the Colombian government, with the backing of the United States, created new units within both the police and the military in order to pursue them. The Bloque de Búsqueda was a new unit created within the Colombian military precisely to go after Pablo Escobar. Hence, they were not able to get to this group. They also rotated many of the people that he had previously bought out of Medellin and brought new ones in. So he'd either have to bribe them or kill them in order to gain their loyalty.
Colombian President Gaviria intensified the manhunt with additional command coordination, electronic bugging interdiction, and 24-hour surveillance.
United States assistance was essential, but the Gaviria government was committed to getting Pablo Escobar too after he escaped from La Catedral. That was a black eye against the Colombian government and a violation of the agreement that they had reached. When Pablo Escobar did that and then went out and killed a bunch of members of his own organization, really the death bell was ringing already.
Escobar had been on the run for over a year, but his luck was about to run out. He had taken refuge in an apartment located in Medellin. While talking to his son on his cellular telephone, the special police were able to identify his location.
They were able to triangulate these communications and focus in on them, and found the block and finally found the apartment complex and the specific place where he was.
Escobar attempted to escape by running across the rooftop of the apartment in which he sought shelter. A barrage of gunfire was exchanged between Escobar and the police. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was gunned down by the Special Police Force on December 2, 1993, one day after his 44th birthday. In the end, Escobar lay dead in a pool of his own blood without any shoes on his feet. The police celebrated in the streets while his family openly mourned his murder.
He died a bloody death. Because at that point, this support structure, if you want to call it that, you know, the protection from above among officials, police and military, and among, you know, his local coteries of supporters in Medellin, that had begun to unravel. And when somebody becomes a public enemy like he was, all of this is going to begin to disintegrate. And it was that, I think, that created the conditions that allowed the police, or the so-called bloque de búsqueda, the search block, to kill him.
Like his life, Escobar's funeral was a combination of joy from those who had personally suffered from his terror and sorrow by those who had benefited from his narco wealth and kindness. The Medellin Cartel had been systematically dismembered. Carlos later was in jail. Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha was gunned down in the sugar cane fields along the Colombian coast, and the Ochoa brothers all copped plea bargains and were sent to prison.
The underbosses of that organization did not disappear. Some of them were thrown in jail as well, but many of them continued to operate on their own. And so we have remnants of the Medellin Cartel.
Years after the death of Pablo Escobar and the demise of his Medellin Cartel, the Colombian narcotics trade is stronger than ever. The large cartel structure has given way to smaller, more efficient organizations that not only traffic cocaine, but heroin as well.
So the figurehead has changed. Pablo Escobar's gone, but we still have a drug problem.
What has changed, for the most part, is the will in Colombia to do something, to salvage their country from a guerrilla force which has aligned itself so well with the drug traffickers.
They are not a cartel. They do not traffic outside of Colombia. They're only partially involved in refining, but nonetheless, they provide protection for landing strips, protection for laboratories. They collect taxes from the peasant growers of both coca leaf and opium poppy.
United States citizens use more illicit drugs than any other country in the world. Escobar recognized this and capitalized upon the American consumer's craving for cocaine.
We don't seem to understand that this is a huge industry. This is an industry that makes a tremendous amount of difference in the economies and the lives of people in South America. We can't just eradicate this industry overnight. And every time we take steps against it, we find that something else crops up in its place.
There are more people leaving Colombia today than any time in the history of the country, because they no longer believe that they can win the war.
The legacy of Pablo Escobar will be felt for generations to come. Until the demand for illegal drugs is neutralized, there will always be a person or an entity willing to satisfy that desire.
I think most of all, what I would remember Pablo Escobar for is for being the major architect of this cocaine industry, one of the most important, most baneful, but also most important industries that has developed in Latin America and really the world.
Regardless of what he did that was good, or perceived to be good, he did it for the proliferation of a criminal organization to bring billions in drug profits back to him personally, so he could send more poison out. I don't believe that a country outside of Colombia knows the devastation of drug trafficking like they do.
He was born as Pablo Escobar. He died the godfather of cocaine. Years after Pablo Escobar's death, people in Medellin still bring flowers to his gravesite. If asked, they might tell you about the home he built for them, or the food he distributed within their impoverished village, or the hospital he constructed for the sick. But for the relatives of the Colombian police officers, journalists, and government officials he assassinated, the reply will be different. They will tell you that Pablo Escobar, who was a ruthless, cold-blooded killer, who seemed to have it all, but in the end, died alone. I'm Robert Stack. Thanks for joining us.